Have you ever been told you're being too loud? Have you ever felt that invisible pressure to shrink yourself, to soften your opinion, to make your presence more agreeable, more palatable, less threatening? A subtle negotiation we perform in boardrooms, at family dinners, or even among friends. But what if I told you that for centuries, this wasn't just a feeling? What if I told you it was a matter of life and death? What if the very things that make you powerful, your wisdom, your independence, your voice, were the very things that could get you killed? Imagine a world where your garden, filled with healing herbs passed down from your grandmother, was not a source of comfort, but a collection of evidence against you. Imagine a world where helping a neighbor through a difficult childbirth could lead you to the gallows, where simply outliving your husband and inheriting his property made you a target for your entire community, where speaking your mind, challenging an injustice, or even laughing too loudly in the street could lead to you being paraded through town with your tongue locked in a cage of cold. This isn't a dark fantasy. This isn't a story from a forgotten mythology. This is a harrowing, deliberately erased story of women. We are not just looking back at history. We are pulling back a blood-soaked curtain on a hidden war, one waged for millennia not on a conventional battlefield with armies and flags, but in quiet villages, in hushed courtrooms, in the sanctity of the home, and inside the minds of women themselves. It was a war of annihilation, targeting women not for what they did, but for the very power they inherently possessed. We will journey through the shadows of time to uncover the stories of the healers who were systematically rebranded as witches, the widows who were hunted for their terrifying freedom, and the thinkers who were silenced for the crime of their wisdom. Stories the history books never taught you, the voices that were choked into silence, the legacies that were burned to ash. I invite you to dim the lights, get comfortable, and step with me into a past that is far closer and far more familiar. A past where the most dangerous, most unforgivable crime of all was simply being a woman. There's a profound and bitter irony that the most iconic image of evil in Western folklore, the witch, a haggard old woman hunched over a bubbling cauldron, muttering strange incantations, a horrifically distorted portrait of a healer at work. Before the rise of formalized university-trained male physicians, the primary keepers of a community's health and well-being were women. The cauldron was not a vessel for poison, simmering with poultices and herbal decoctions. The strange ingredients were not eye of newt, but foxglove for the heart, willow bark for pain, and chamomile for a fevered child. The incantations were not demonic spells, but the passed-down knowledge of generations, an oral tradition of healing that was practical, effective, and deeply essential. In the end, is precisely what made them so catastrophically dangerous. Imagine a 16th century German village. A woman named Walpurga Hausmannen serves as the community's midwife. She has been a pillar of the village. She has safely delivered hundreds of babies, using techniques and herbal remedies her mother and grandmother taught her. She knows how to turn a breech baby in the womb, a skill that baffled university men. She knows how to use spider webs with their natural clotting properties, bleeding after birth. She knows how to brew a tea from willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, to ease the excruciating pains of labor. In our modern world, she would be a celebrated and respected medical professional, a practitioner of what we now call evidence-based folk medicine. Her very success became the kindling for her funeral pyre. In an age without sanitation, antibiotics, or modern surgical techniques, some births went wrong. A baby would be stillborn. A mother would succumb to a postpartum infection. These were tragic, but natural occurrences. As a new kind of power began to rise, the power of the male-dominated church and a fledgling medical establishment, the narrative began to twist with a venomous purpose. Walpurga's successes were no longer attributed to her skill, but to a sinister pact with the devil. Her failures were no longer tragic accidents, but malicious, premeditated acts of witchcraft. The community she had served turned on her. She was tortured, and under unimaginable agony, she confessed to whatever her accusers wanted to hear. She confessed to killing 40 babies, to rubbing them with a magic salve to make them fly. She was burned alive. Her crime was not murder. Her crime was knowledge. This was not an isolated incident. Systematic campaign of erasure and appropriation. The rise of a formal, exclusively male medical establishment created a direct and existential conflict with these traditional female healers. University physicians, who often learned their trade from ancient Latin texts written by other men who had never once witnessed a childbirth, felt deeply threatened by the practical, hands-on success rates of common midwives. How could they possibly justify their exorbitant fees, their social prestige, and their academic authority when an ignorant village woman often had better outcomes? The answer was as simple as it was brutal. You do not compete with her. You rebrand her expertise as evil, her cures as curses, as a demonic pact. This genocidal campaign found its ultimate weapon in a book that can rightly be called the most dangerously and profoundly misogynistic text ever published, the Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. First published in 1487 by two German Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, was not a work of fantasy. It was a detailed, legalistic, step-by-step manual on how to identify, prosecute, torture, and ultimately destroy women accused of witchcraft. For over 200 years, it was a runaway bestseller, second only to the Bible in many parts of Europe. It was not the ravings of fringe lunatics. It was given the stamp of papal approval and was treated as a definitive academic and legal text on the subject. It gave divine theological justification for the murder of tens of thousands of women. The book's logic was as grotesquely circular as it was insane. It was divided into 3 parts. The first part was dedicated to proving, with scholastic certainty, that witchcraft was real and that women were its primary agents. The authors argued with chilling sincerity that women were intellectually like children, morally weak, more impressionable, and possessed an insatiable carnal lust which made them easy and willing prey for the devil. The very word female, they claimed through a twisted etymological fallacy, came from the Latin words fe and minus, meaning lesser in faith. From the very first page, a woman's gender was presented as the primary and most damning piece of evidence against her. The Malleus Maleficarum then specifically targeted midwives, calling them, without hyperbole, the most dangerous and evil witches of. It claimed they would kill babies in the womb, offer unbaptized newborns to demons at satanic Sabbaths, and use their intimate knowledge of the female body to cause infertility and impotence. The sacred act of bringing life into the world was meticulously reframed as a demonic conspiracy. The book provided a terrifyingly broad checklist of suspicious behaviors that could be used to identify a witch. Did a woman have a birthmark, a mole, or a third nipple that was a devil's mark, a place where a demon had physically branded her as his own? Did she keep a cat for company and comfort? A demonic spirit in animal form that aided in her evil deeds. Did she mutter to herself while tending her garden? She was not thinking aloud. She was casting spells. The accusations could reach levels of pure, mind-bending absurdity. In 16th century England, a poor, elderly woman named Agnes Waterhouse was accused because her neighbor's butter repeatedly failed to churn. A churn of bad butter was considered a classic sign of demonic interference, a bewitching of the cream. After brutal interrogation, likely involving sleep deprivation, and pricking with needles to find the devil's mark, Agnes confessed, likely saying anything at all to make the unbearable pain stop. Her story, and thousands upon thousands like it, revealed the terrifying reality of life for women in this era. In a world steeped in superstition, fear, and a desperate need for scapegoats, any woman could be turned into a monster. A domestic dispute with a neighbor, a failed crop, a sudden illness in the village livestock. It was all so much easier to blame on the old woman down the lane and her supposed dark magic than to accept the harsh, terrifying randomness of life and death. Historians now estimate that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe and colonial America in 18th centuries. A staggering 80% of them were women. But for every woman who was hanged, drowned, or burned, thousands more lived under a constant, suffocating cloud of terror. They were forced to hide their knowledge of herbs, to suppress their healing skills, to second-guess their own instincts and intuition. The brilliant midwives we lost, the compassionate herbalists whose cures were forgotten, the wise women who were brutally silenced. The intellectual and cultural loss is incalculable. Centuries of accumulated medical wisdom, passed from mother to daughter through generations, were incinerated in the witch-burning pyres. This war on knowledge set back women's health care in ways we are only now beginning to fully understand, leaving a legacy of medical mistrust and dismissed female pain that lingers to this day. The first front in the war on women was a war on their minds, a vicious campaign that turned their greatest strength into their most unforgivable and fatal crime. In the rigid, suffocatingly patriarchal structure of medieval and early modern Europe, a woman's entire life, her very legal and social existence, was defined by her relationship to a man. She was the property of her father. He dictated her education, her movements, and her future. Then, upon marriage, in a legal tradition known as coverture, ownership was ceremonially transferred to her husband. Under coverture, a woman's legal identity was literally subsumed or covered. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign a contract. She could not sue or be sued. She had no legal claim to her own earnings or even to her own children. She was, in the eyes of the law, an extension of her husband, a domestic asset. But what happened when her husband died? Suddenly, a woman existed outside of this neat, oppressive system of control, and in the eyes of society built on male authority, she became a glitch in the matrix, a dangerous and terrifying anomaly who had to be swiftly controlled or, if necessary, eliminated. A widow was threatening for two primary, interconnected reasons: property and independence. In many parts of Europe, a widow had a legal right to a portion of her husband's estate, known as her dower, which was meant to support her in her widowhood. This meant that for the very first time in her life, a woman might have direct control over land, a merchant business, and significant financial resources. She was no longer simply an asset on a man's balance sheet. She was the asset manager. This newfound economic power made her male relatives, her former husband's business rivals, and even the local church deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. How could a weaker vessel, a creature of emotion and inferior intellect, possibly manage such complex affairs? Her existence created an impossible double bind. If she succeeded in managing her property and growing her wealth, her success was inherently suspicious and unnatural. It was held up as definitive proof that women were indeed incapable of handling responsibility and needed male oversight. It was a game she was never intended to win. Consider the story of Dame Alice Keitler, a wealthy Irish innkeeper and moneylender in the early 14th century. Alice was not just intelligent, she was a brilliant businesswoman. She was also shrewd, charismatic, and had the profound and unforgivable audacity to outlive not one, not two, but four husbands, growing significantly wealthier and more influential with each death. By the 1320s, she was one of the most powerful people in Kilkenny. She owned multiple properties, ran a thriving inn, and was a major moneylender to local nobles and merchants. Her success was so astounding, so completely outside the expected norms for a woman of her time, that her jealous peers could only find one plausible explanation. The accusations were spearheaded by her own stepchildren, who were desperate to get their hands on their inheritance and resentful of her power. They claimed she had used sorcery and poison to murder their fathers, that she consorted with a demon named Robin Ardison, and that she used dark magic to bewitch men and accumulate her vast fortune. The local Bishop of Ossory, a man who also happened to owe Alice a great deal of money, eagerly and piously took up the case, likely seeing a divine opportunity to clear his debts and seize her assets for the church. Alice, however, was no simple victim. In a nearly unprecedented move for the time, she used her considerable wealth and powerful connections to fight back against the charges. She challenged the bishop's authority, accused him of defamation, and ultimately fled to England, escaping the pyre with her life and much of her fortune. But her maid, Petronilla de Meath, was not so lucky. Left behind to face the inquisitors, Petronilla was brutally tortured, forced to confess that she and Alice had engaged in all manner of dark magic, and became the first person in the history of Ireland to be burned at the stake for heresy. Alice's story is a perfect, chilling illustration of the widow's paradox. The very skills that made her a successful and independent woman, her intelligence, her financial acumen, her resilience, were the same qualities used to condemn her as a servant of the devil. The social pressure on widows to remarry was immense and immediate. An independent woman controlling property was a loose thread in the tightly woven social fabric. The quickest and most efficient way to restore order was to marry her off, her property swiftly back under the control of a new man. The king himself claimed the legal right to arrange the marriages of wealthy aristocratic widows, essentially auctioning them off to the highest bidding noble who could pay for the privilege. Refusing to remarry was seen as a profound act of rebellion. It suggested that a woman might actually prefer her independence, a truly terrifying and subversive thought. This preference for freedom was often interpreted as a sign of moral corruption or, once again, as evidence of witchcraft. This reality was underpinned by the broader, brutal system of the medieval marriage market. For all but the poorest classes, marriage was rarely about love or companionship. It was a business transaction, a strategic alliance between families. Women were the primary currency. A daughter's marriage was a deal negotiated between her father, and her dowry was her explicit price tag. Legal documents from the period are shockingly blunt, listing a woman's value in acres of land, heads of livestock, political connections, and cash. The woman herself had little to no say in the matter. Her consent was a convenient afterthought, not a legal necessity. while preaching the spiritual sanctity of marriage, was fully complicit in this system of human trafficking. Canon law required parental consent for a marriage to be valid, but this meant the consent of the bride's father. A 14th century English legal text explicitly stated that a woman's will in the matter of her own marriage is subordinate to her father's judgment, because her understanding is naturally inferior. Women were considered too foolish and emotional to choose their own partners, yet were simultaneously expected to run a complex household, raise pious children, and be the moral center of the family. The entire system was designed to keep women in a state of perpetual dependency, and if they were lucky enough to have sons, on them in their old age. The widow was the one figure who spectacularly broke this chain of command. She had experienced life under male authority, and now, through the grim lottery of death, she understood the rules of the world, but was no longer bound by them in the same way. This made her an object of both intense fear and morbid fascination. She was a living symbol of what all women might become if left unsupervised, independent, resourceful, and in control of their own destinies. And in a world built on the unshakable foundation of female subjugation, there was simply no greater or more urgent threat. The war on the home was, at its core, a war on female autonomy, an unending campaign to ensure that a woman's place remained firmly and safely under man's thumb, whether he was living or dead. Of all the forms of power that women possessed, simmering beneath the surface of a male-dominated world, perhaps the one society feared most profoundly was the power of their voice. A woman's words could challenge authority. They could share forbidden knowledge. They could build communities and expose injustice. A woman's voice could plant the seed of an idea, and an idea could topple an empire. For centuries, a systematic, ruthless, and often sadistic war was waged to silence her. This was not always a metaphorical war of suppression. In some terrifying cases, it was brutally, shockingly literal. Allow me to introduce you to the scold's bridle, also known as the brank. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most psychologically cruel and misogynistic instruments of torture ever invented by the human mind, designed with the single, specific purpose of silencing women. Picture an iron cage, a gruesome metal framework that was fitted over a woman's head and locked at the back. Inside the cage was a flat piece of iron, a bit plate, which was forced into her mouth and pressed down hard upon her tongue. It was often covered in sharp spikes, designed to shred her tongue, cheeks, and gums as she made the slightest attempt to speak. She could not swallow without agonizing pain. All she could do was mumble and groan in agony. To complete the humiliation, some versions even had a bell attached to the top, which would ring with her every movement, drawing the attention and scorn of everyone she passed. Who was subjected to this horrific device? Not murderers, thieves, or traitors. The scold's bridle was reserved for scolds, nags, or gossips. In other words, women who talked too much. And what constituted talking too much? The definition was deliberately, strategically vague. It could mean arguing with her husband. It could mean complaining about a merchant who had cheated her in the market. It could mean questioning the pronouncements of the local priest. It could mean defending herself too vigorously against an accusation. Any woman who spoke out of turn, who refused to be submissive, who used her voice in a way that challenged male authority. The punishment was always a public spectacle. The bridal woman would be chained by a leash and paraded to the town square, often led by her own husband or a town official, who was thus seen to be taming his unruly wife. The people she had known her entire life were encouraged to mock her, to throw mud, rotten fruit, and animal filth at her. It was an exercise in ultimate public degradation, designed not just to punish one woman, but to terrorize all the other women who witnessed it. The message was unmistakable and seared into the collective female psyche. This is what happens when you use your voice. Keep quiet, or this will be you. This pathological fear of the female voice permeated every level of society. While the bridal was the most extreme and physical manifestation of this war, the silencing took countless other forms. Women were forbidden from speaking in church, their spiritual insights deemed irrelevant unless mediated by a male priest. They were barred from universities, from any form of political life. Their testimony in a court of law was often considered less valuable than a man's, or inadmissible altogether. The very act of gossip, a word that once simply meant a godparent or a close friend and described intimate conversation, was systematically demonized and framed as a uniquely female sin. It was a clever and effective way of invalidating the powerful networks of information, support, and community that women built through conversation. What men called important discourse when it happened in the tavern, or the town square was labeled idle, malicious chatter when it happened among women by the river or around the spinning wheel. Even at the highest echelons of power, a woman's voice was a dangerous liability. Look at the tragic fate of Anne Boleyn, the brilliant and headstrong second wife of King Henry VIII of England. Anne was not like the queens who came before her. She was fiercely intelligent, politically astute, and vocally opinionated. She wasn't content to be a passive, decorative broodmare for the king. She actively debated theology with him. She championed the cause of religious reform, and she was a formidable player in the high-stakes game of court politics. It was her sharp mind and captivating conversation that had attracted the powerful king, but once she was queen, those very same qualities became her undoing when she failed to produce. The male heir Henry desperately craved and continued to challenge the king's will. Her voice transformed from an asset into a threat. Filled with her enemies and eager to please a tyrant king, concocted a series of outrageous and almost certainly false charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Her enemies twisted her intelligence against her, arguing she was so cunning and manipulative that she could bewitch men and hide her treachery. In 1536, the woman who had used her voice and influence to change the course of English history was executed by a French swordsman. Her true crime was not treason. It was having a powerful voice that she refused to let any man, even a king, control. Perhaps no story encapsulates the tragic paradox of the powerful female voice more than that of Joan of Arc. A teenage peasant girl from a remote village, Joan's voice was so clear, so filled with an unshakable conviction, that it rallied a defeated and demoralized army, crowned a king, and saved France from English domination. She claimed her voice and her instructions came directly from God, and as long as she was winning battles and serving the strategic interests of the men in power, they were more than happy to believe her. She was a divine instrument, a holy messenger. But the moment the tide of war began to turn, the moment her strategic advice began to conflict with that of the seasoned, aristocratic male commanders, her voice was violently recontextualized. It was no longer the voice of God. It was the voice of a deluded, arrogant, and dangerous heretic, which was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The same fiery conviction that had inspired a nation was used as proof of her sinful pride. Her claims of divine communication were twisted into evidence of demonic delusion. A room full of the most powerful and educated churchmen in the land was united in its determination to break and silence this young, uneducated woman who dared to speak with an authority they believed was not hers to claim. They could not defeat her brilliant, so they attacked her character, her faith, and her gender. Joan was burned at the stake. They killed her not because she had lost on the battlefield, but because her voice had become too powerful, too independent, and too much her own. From the iron cage of the scold's bridle to the executioner's block, the message thundered across the centuries with chilling consistency. A woman's knowledge was dangerous. Her independence was a threat, but her voice was the ultimate weapon, and it had to be silenced at any and every cost. The war on the mouth was a war on her very essence, on her ability to reason, to connect, to protest, and to express her fundamental humanity and challenge the world around her. In the face of such relentless, systematic, and brutal oppression, it would be easy to assume that women for centuries simply endured their fate, but to believe that would be to fall for the most enduring lie of patriarchal history. It would be a profound underestimation of their boundless strength, their deep-seated resilience, and their remarkable ingenuity. Where open defiance meant certain death, resistance simply went underground. In the shadows of a world that sought to isolate, divide, and control them, women built secret, powerful networks of solidarity and support. History doesn't give them a formal, unified name, but we can call them the spinning wheel sisterhoods. On the surface, it was the most innocuous and socially approved of scenes. A group of women from the village gathered in a cottage on a long winter evening. The air is warm on the hearth, filled with the hum of spinning wheels, the quiet clicking of needles, and the soft chatter of voices. To any husband, father, or priest who might glance inside, it was a picture of perfect domestic industry, but this scene of domesticity was the perfect cover, busy with the endless, repetitive work that society demanded of them, mending garments. Their minds and mouths were engaged in something truly revolutionary. They were sharing vital information, preserving forbidden knowledge, and sustaining each other's spirits in a world designed to break them. Hidden circles were the beating heart of a female counterculture. What sounded to an outsider like idle, meaningless gossip was, in fact, a sophisticated and highly effective intelligence network. A seemingly innocent comment about a neighbor's recent difficult childbirth was a chance to discreetly share life-saving medical techniques that were being demonized by the male medical establishment. A sad story about a friend's harsh and drunken husband was a coded lesson in how to navigate or survive domestic abuse, offering strategies for de-escalation or protection. They used their socially approved gatherings to conduct the essential business of survival. These networks were astonishingly complex. They often function as informal economies, operating entirely outside of male control. They were micro-lenders, pooling their meager resources to help a woman whose husband had gambled away their food money. They were credit unions, helping a new widow get started in a trade. They were business cooperatives, organizing group purchases of expensive materials like wool or dye to get a better price. They were banks, support groups, and intelligence agencies all rolled into one, operating with perfect camouflage right under the noses of the very men who dismissed their talk as trivial and meaningless. This quiet, persistent, underground resistance was the fertile soil from which a more overt revolution would eventually grow. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as the world began to churn with new ideas of liberty and individual rights, individual women began to dare to speak their truths publicly. Women like Mary Wollstonecraft in England, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a book so radical for its time that its core argument was simply that women were rational human beings who were deserving of an education. She was viciously attacked by the press and called a hyena in petticoats. Later came the suffragettes, women who moved from polite, ignored petitions to bold acts of civil disobedience. They chained themselves to railings, they shattered windows, and they went on hunger strikes when imprisoned. They were held down by guards and force-fed through tubes shoved down their throats, a brutal, invasive procedure that amounted to legalized torture. One of the leaders of the American suffrage movement was subjected to this torment repeatedly, yet she always returned to the protest line, her will unbroken. These women knew, with a certainty that is hard for us to comprehend, that the price of progress was steep, and they consciously chose to pay it with their health, their reputations, their freedom, and sometimes their very lives. Why do these stories from centuries ago still matter so deeply? Why dredge up this painful, brutal past? Because the war isn't over. The battlefield have changed and the weapons have become more subtle, but the echoes of this history are all around us, often in forms we fail to recognize. The witch hunt has not vanished. It has been modernized and digitized. When a woman speaks out publicly today, especially on a controversial topic, she often faces a vicious, coordinated torrent of online mob harassment. She is swamped with vile, hateful comments, with graphic threats of sexual violence, with attempts to destroy her career by contacting her employer, with a terrifying violation of doxing, where her private information is spread across the internet. Faceless crowd of the digital age has replaced the torch-wielding village mob, but the fundamental goal remains identical: to silence her, to punish her for daring to have a public voice, and to make an example of her for any other woman who might consider speaking out. The scold's bridle has evolved into more insidious, but equally effective, forms of silencing we see in our professional and social lives. It's the corporate boardroom where a woman's brilliant ideas met with silence or lukewarm acknowledgement, only to be celebrated as genius when a male colleague rephrases and repeats it 5 minutes later, a phenomenon now known as heapiating. It's a performance review that criticizes a woman for being abrasive, bossy, or aggressive for displaying the exact same assertive, decisive behaviors that are praised as strong leadership in her male counterparts. It's the constant, exhausting tone policing, the demand that she soften her message, smile more, and make her valid points in a way that doesn't make the men in the room feel uncomfortable. The Malleus Maleficarum's core assertion that women are inherently emotional, untrustworthy, and hysterical finds its chilling modern echo in the medical world. Women's pain is systematically and statistically undertreated. Serious physical symptoms, particularly for conditions like endometriosis or autoimmune diseases, are far more likely to be dismissed by doctors as anxiety, stress, or psychosomatic. This medical gaslighting has real, devastating, and sometimes fatal consequences, yet stems directly from the same ancient, poisonous prejudice that women are not credible witnesses to their own bodily experiences. The widow who was hunted for her economic independence has become the single mother who is shamed for relying on social support systems, or the child-free, unmarried professional woman who is constantly questioned about her life choices, as if her existence outside of a traditional family structure is somehow unnatural, selfish, or incomplete. But just as the methods of oppression have evolved, so too have the tools of resistance. The spinning wheel sisterhoods have become powerful global online communities, where women connect, share experiences, offer support, and organize for change across continents and time zones. The single brave voice of a Mary Wollstonecraft has become the global chorus of movements like #MeToo, where the collective testimony of millions of women speaking together has forced a cultural reckoning with sexual abuse and harassment that were once shrouded in impenetrable silence. The stories of the women who came before us are not just tragedies to be mourned. They are profound testaments to an unbreakable human spirit. They are a legacy of fierce and brilliant resilience. The healers, the widows, the thinkers, the speakers of truth, they endured the unimaginable so that one day their daughters and their daughters' daughters could live in a world where their minds are celebrated, their independence is respected, and their voices are heard. Their fight is now our fight, and their immense sacrifice demand that we do not, under any circumstances, fall silent. Every time a woman speaks her truth in a world that would prefer her quiet, she honors the millions who were silenced. Every time she embraces her own power, she reclaims it for the countless women from whom it was stolen. The journey has been long, dark, and brutal, but the voices of women, once a scattered and terrified whisper, are now growing into a roar that is beginning to reshape the very foundations of our world. And that is a sound that can never be caged again. We have walked through the fire-scorched fields of history together. We have stood in the shadow of the gallows, felt the cold iron of the bridle against our own tongues, and heard the echoes of silenced voices in the wind. Bear witness to this history is to carry a heavy weight. It is a history of profound pain, of unimaginable loss, and of a war so long and so pervasive that its conclusion seems impossibly distant. But to stop here, to merely recount the atrocities of the past, would be to do a grave disservice to the very women whose stories we have unearthed. It would be to leave them as victims, frozen in their suffering. And they were not just victims, they were survivors. They were the architects of a revolution that is still unfolding. The truth is, we are living in the world they bled for. We are the inheritors of their sacrifice. Every woman who casts a vote, who owns a business, who chooses her own partner, who decides what happens to her own body, stands on a mountain of sacrifice built by the women who came before. They fought for rights they would never know, for freedoms they could only dream of. They did not pass us a torch of vengeance. They passed us a torch of responsibility. The question that now hangs in the air, heavy with the weight of all that history, is no longer just what happened to them, but what will we do now? The battlefields of this unfinished revolution look different, but they are no less treacherous. The front lines are not in the village square, but in the digital square. They are not in the torture chamber, but in the boardroom and the operating room. And perhaps most critically, the most insidious battlefield of all is within our own minds. For centuries, the most effective tool of patriarchy was not the executioner's axe, but the slow, steady drip of psychological conditioning. Women were taught that their value was in their silence, their compliance, their beauty, their service to others. We were taught to be rivals for male attention, to see other women not as allies, but as competition. The ghost of this conditioning haunts us still. It is the voice of internalized misogyny that telling us we are not smart enough for promotion, that our anger is unattractive, that our ambition is unseemly. It is the insidious pressure to be the cool girl, the one who isn't like other women, the one who doesn't make a fuss, a modern betrayal of the sisterhood that was once a lifeline. This internal cage is the most difficult one to break, because we've been taught to build it ourselves. It manifests as imposter syndrome, a condition that disproportionately affects high-achieving women, making them feel like frauds on the verge of being exposed, despite all evidence of their competence. It manifests in the way we police each other's choices, judging the stay-at-home mom and the career-driven CEO with equal, though different. Dismantling this internal architecture of oppression is the first and most crucial act of modern resistance. It requires a radical self-love and a fierce, unwavering solidarity with all women, even and especially the ones whose choices differ from our own. Beyond our minds, the fight rages in the new arenas of power. Consider the digital world. While technology has given women unprecedented platforms to connect and organize, it has also created a terrifyingly efficient new weapon for mass silencing. The algorithms that dictate what we see are often encoded with old biases, prioritizing male voices and perspectives. And online harassment has become a tool of terror. It is not random trolling. A strategic campaign of psychological warfare designed to make the digital public square so toxic and dangerous for women that they will choose to retreat into silence for their own safety and sanity. To fight back is to refuse to be silenced, to report, to block, to support the women being targeted. and to demand that tech companies take responsibility for the cesspools of misogyny they profit from. The war on economic independence also continues, repackaged in corporate jargon. We talk about the gender pay gap, but it is so much more than that. It is the investment gap, where female-founded startups receive a tiny fraction of the venture capital that male-founded ones do. It is a promotion gap, where women are often praised for their collaborative skills, but passed over for leadership roles in favor of men seen as having more authority. It is the motherhood penalty, where a woman's earnings and career trajectory often plummet after having a child, while a man's often improves. Economic freedom is the bedrock of all other freedoms. A woman who cannot support herself cannot truly be free. The modern resistance, therefore, involves demanding pay transparency, investing in female-owned businesses, fighting for paid family leave, and championing women into positions of economic power. And then there is the most ancient battlefield of all, our own bodies. The ongoing, relentless legislative battles over reproductive rights are a direct, unbroken continuation of the historical belief that women's bodies are not their own property. They are a resource to be managed and controlled by the state. The language has changed from heresy to the sanctity of life, but the underlying premise is identical. A woman is not the sovereign ruler of her own physical self. To control a woman's reproductive destiny is to control her entire life, her education, her career, her economic stability. The fight for reproductive justice is not a nit, it is the absolute cornerstone of female liberation. So what does wielding the fire of this revolution look like in our daily lives? It is both simpler and more complex than we imagine. It begins with the voice. We must use the voices our foremothers were killed for having. Use it to ask for a raise. Use it to challenge a sexist joke. Use it to share your idea in a meeting. And if it is ignored, state it again. Use it to tell your own story in your own words. A personal narrative is a revolutionary act. It refutes the centuries of men attempting to define our experiences for us. But it is not enough to find our own voice. We must become amplifiers of the voices of others. The history of women's movements is tragically stained by exclusion, particularly of women of color, queer women, and disabled women. A feminism that only serves the most privileged among us is not feminism. It is merely a recalibration of power within the same oppressive structure. True resistance lies in intersectionality. It means a white woman using her platform to amplify the work of black women. It means an able-bodied woman fighting for the accessibility rights of her disabled sisters. It means a cisgender woman standing in fierce solidarity with her transgender sisters, recognizing that their liberation is bound together. When a woman with privilege speaks, she should ask herself, who is not in this room, and how can I bring their voice here with me? It is also not for women to wage alone. Men are not the enemy. The patriarchal system that traps us all is the enemy. For our male allies, the task is to move beyond passive support and into active partnership. It means listening when women speak about their experiences, without the urge to question or explain it away. It means ceding the floor in a conversation and amplifying a female colleague's point. It means looking around the table in a position of power and asking, why are there no women here? Most importantly, it means calling out misogyny in the spaces where women are not present. The locker room, the group chat, the poker game. It is in those spaces that the culture is built and maintained. To dismantle it, men must be willing to use their privilege to challenge the very system that grants it. We stand at a unique, precarious, and powerful moment in history. We are the first generations of women to be armed with the sheer volume of our own stories, with the legal frameworks of rights, however imperfectly applied, and with the technological tools to connect with each other on a global scale. The ghosts of the silenced women are not haunting us. They are in the wind at our backs, cheering us on. The fire that the Inquisitors tried to extinguish in every midwife and healer is the very fire that now lights our way forward. The path ahead is long. There will be setbacks. There will be backlash. There will be moments of profound despair. But the women whose stories we've shared tonight, the witches, the widows, the scolds, the revolutionaries, have taught us a vital lesson. They have taught us that progress is not a straight line, but a relentless, determined push against an immense and heavy door. Every generation has the responsibility to push with all its might. Our task is to honor their sacrifice not with memorials of stone, but with lives of courage, to live so fully, to speak so clearly, to dream so audaciously that their suffering was not in vain. The revolution is unfinished. The work is ours, and we are ready. We have the stories, we have the solidarity, and we have the fire. Let's get to work.